Let me try that again. Good evening. Give him a chance to catch up to me. Well, welcome, and thank you for braving the winter wonderland that we have suddenly found ourselves in again this evening. And I'm glad you made it safely. We're going to leave the doors open as others who may still be on their way so they can join us as we proceed through the evening. And we've also given those who may not feel so safe coming the option to stream it online as well. So for those of you who are here and for those of you who are viewing this online tonight, welcome to the Fine Arts Association. My name is Paul Holm and I'm the CEO of the Fine Arts Association. And on behalf of our faculty and our staff and our board of directors, I want to welcome you to this special presentation of PBS Western Reserve here at the Fine Arts Association. As a reminder, now would be a good time to silence your phones in case you get a weather warning or something like that. For those of you who may not know, the Fine Arts Association, based here in Willoughby, was founded in 1957 as a school of fine arts. We're now a community arts center with regional impact that specializes in art education, performance, and therapeutic services utilizing the arts. We offer classes in all disciplines, from music, theater, dance, visual arts, and the creative arts therapies. So if there's someone in your life that likes to sing or dance or paint or draw or wants to learn to play a musical instrument or even act on this stage, we consider or ask you to consider signing them up for a class. Now I want to introduce Natalie Pillsbury, who is the current president and CEO at PBS Western Reserve. Natalie has worked in public media since 2015, first at WKSU as a senior leadership role, managing major gifts, grant fundraising programs, and strategic planning. She served IdeaStream Public Media as director of strategic content initiatives, where she led the digital content team and the multiple media, journalism, and production team. She was a member of the organization's strategic operating team and a member of the senior team in content. Other prior appointments include Associate Director of Donor Engagement and Leadership Giving at the University of Chicago and Annual Giving Officer at Women Employed in the Greater Chicago Area. A native of Kent, Ohio, where I live, yay, Kent. Pillsbury graduated from Kent State University with a bachelor's degree in journalism in 2007 and a master's degree in public administration in 2023. And she lives in Kent with her husband, 2 children, and most importantly, and her dog, Pete. Natalie, it's a pleasure to welcome you and PBS Western Reserve here tonight, and we look forward to a fascinating evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you to everyone who's here tonight, both on the live stream and here in person. We are so grateful to the Fine Arts Association for partnering with us on this event, and we are in for a delightful evening. I'd like to thank our moderator, David Malinowski, and our panelists for bringing their expertise and knowledge to this event, and for answering our audience questions. We're thrilled to be in this space here to bring together our community in conversation about the genius of Leonardo da Vinci. Thanks to all of you for attending and for your support of public media as viewers and as members, and also thank you for your support of the fine arts. The future of public media's federal funding is uncertain, but it's audiences like this that reinforce the value local public media has for its community. We know that we can rely on your support so that we can continue providing arts and culture, informational, educational, news programming to everyone in our broadcast footprint, which includes all of Northeast Ohio and into Western Pennsylvania. We have 4.9 million people that we serve in this region. And we provide all of those people with programming, educational resources, community events, and more for free. If you're interested in learning more about PBS Western Reserve and connecting in with our programming and events, please visit our table in the lobby. You can sign up for our newsletters, learn more about volunteer opportunities, learn more about this documentary, make a donation and become a member, and more. It's now my pleasure to introduce our screening of Ken Burns's Da Vinci. This documentary is a masterful exploration of the life and works of Leonardo da Vinci, one of history's most enigmatic and influential figures. Through Burns's signature style, our screen, through Burns's signature style, blending archival footage, expert interviews, and narrated excerpts from Da Vinci's notebooks. The documentary offers a deep dive into the Renaissance genius's multifaceted contributions to art, science, and innovation. Da Vinci not only illuminates the achievements of this polymath, but also delves into the profound human curiosity and relentless pursuit of knowledge that drove his every endeavor. Burns's meticulous attention to historical detail and storytelling excellence makes this documentary a compelling watch for anyone interested in understanding the breadth and depth of Da Vinci's legacy. The screening that we're about to present is about 40 minutes of the full 4-hour documentary. If you're interested in watching the entire documentary, it's available through Passport, which is a streaming platform for PBS Western Reserve members. If you're a member and have access to Passport, be sure to select PBS Western Reserve as your local station so that you can enjoy all of our local content. If you'd like more information about Passport or becoming a member of PBS Western Reserve, visit our table in the lobby. Thank you so much and enjoy the program.
Hi, I'm Ken Burns. Thank you for joining this event to learn more about our newest film, Leonardo da Vinci. Because of your support, we can bring films like this to you and your community. I hope it's only the beginning of your exploration into the world and mind of Leonardo. Enjoy.
Major funding for Leonardo da Vinci was provided by the Better Angels Society and its members, the Paul and Sandra Montrone family, Stephen A. Schwartzman, Diane and Hal Brierly, Carol and Ned Speaker, and these additional members. Funding was also provided by Gilbert S. Oman and Martha Darling, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Robert and Mercedes Eichholz Foundation, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
And looking back, push us forward? Will our voice be heard through time? Can our past inspire our future? Bank of America supports filmmakers like Ken Burns, whose narratives illuminate new perspectives.
A good painter must depict two principal things, namely the person and the intentions of their mind. The first is easy, the second, difficult.
The modernity of Leonardo is that he understands that knowledge and imagination are intimately related.
Which nerve causes the eye to move so that the motion of one eye moves the other? On closing the eyelids, on opening the eyes, on expressing wonder.
There is a delightful, unbridled joy of curiosity in him. His duty is to the question. His duty is to the thirst for knowledge. Basically, he says, the thing that was given to me by the universe was the chance to question it. And that is my divine duty.
C'est compliqué d'avoir une idée exacte de Léonard parce qu'il a été obscurci par des siècles de romantisme. On a imaginé quelqu'un de très mystérieux. Comme il avait une longue barbe, on lui a prêté toutes sortes d'intentions alchimiques, métaphysiques, etc. Léonard, en vérité, était un homme de cour, extrêmement rationnel, mais qui était d'abord d'excellente compagnie. On est fasciné quand on lit les textes de ses contemporains de voir à quel point il était drôle, il était sympathique, il était plaisant, il était à la mode, et que tout le monde prenait d'abord un grand plaisir à sa personne avant d'en prendre à son art. Tous ses contemporains sont unanimes là-dessus. Léonard était lui-même une œuvre d'art avant d'en faire.
He began few paintings and finished even fewer. But more than 500 years after his death, those he left behind are among the most revered works of art of all time. A draftsman of incomparable talent, he sketched everything: people and landscapes, flora and fauna, machines both real and imagined, equations, fables, and allegories. Painting on wood panels made from walnut or poplar trees, he devised new ways to portray how men and women convey their deepest emotions. Movements of the mind, he called it. And elevated painting from a craft to an intellectual pursuit. He read Greek and Roman philosophers, but frequently questioned their wisdom. Real knowledge, he believed, was found in nature and best gained through observation and experience. He studied fossils and water dynamics, dissected cadavers, and mapped the circulatory system and the human brain. He attempted to solve the ancient geometric problem of squaring the circle. And he staged experiments on the nature of falling objects more than a century before Galileo and Newton. To him, everything, geology, physics, anatomy, mathematics, art, was inextricably linked. Writing backwards in a mirror script, he began treatises on a vast array of subjects, combining image and text to communicate profound insights that were, in some cases, centuries ahead of their time. But he left most of them incomplete and published none in his lifetime. A singular genius, he filled his notebooks with calculations and questions, theories and innovations, revealing a mind of infinite curiosity. In an age of astonishing artistic advances and a newfound reverence for humanity, Leonardo da Vinci made his way, he said, as a discepolo dell'esperienza, a disciple of experience.
Here forms, here colors, here the character of every part of the universe is concentrated to a point. And that point is so marvelous a thing.
If there's a golden thread that runs through all of Leonardo's work, I think it's an attempt to crack the code of organic form. He's persuaded that there are profound likenesses, profound equivalences to be found in the movement of the stars and in the behavior of an anthill. That, more than anything else, is what obsessed Leonardo and what gives his work a kind of unity.
These indeed are miracles. In so small a space, the universe can be reproduced and rearranged in its whole expanse.
Leonardo received another commission to paint a portrait of the young poet Ginevra da Vinci, the daughter of a wealthy, well-connected banking family who had occasional dealings with Leonardo's father.
To look at the Ginevra da Vinci is probably one of the great ways to understand Leonardo's early painting technique. It is a very deliberated, very protracted process. The painting is done on a very thin poplar wood panel, and it has a priming that is gesso. Leonardo began by doing the cartoon, a full-scale drawing on paper. He pricked the outlines and rubbed with a pouncing bag while the panel was underneath, a technique we call spolvero. The oil medium, it's basically linseed oil and pigments. He applied in the thinnest veils, what we call the glazes or the velature in Italian. Layer by infinitesimal layer, he's able to calibrate the tonal transitions that permit him to explore the sfumato technique, where you blend the gradations in such a way that they seem to be the manner of smoke.
In a playful reference to Ginevra's name, Leonardo surrounded her with juniper branches, ginepro in Italian.
In un'epoca in cui il ritratto femminile era sempre quasi esclusivamente un ritratto di profilo. Quindi un ritratto in cui la persona raffigurata non scambia con noi osservatori uno sguardo. La persona raffigurata di profilo è in un certo senso inavvicinabile. Nel voltarsi ci dice anche che ha diritto in un certo senso a un proprio sguardo sul mondo, a fare esperienza del mondo. È uno sguardo però chiaramente non che non caratterizzerei come aperto o seducente o invitante. È uno sguardo gelido, in un certo senso viene rappresentata un po' come una sfinge. E ricorda quindi anche molto questo, l'unico verso che si conserva di Ginevra, che era attiva anche come poetessa, in cui chiede scusa, è la prima frase, il primo verso di una sestina, e lei chiede scusa al suo interlocutore per essere, si definisce una tigre di montagna. Quindi è un animale indomabile, solitario, selvatico e come dire, con un forte senso di sé e della propria alterità.
We can already see how intensely Leonardo believes that the motions of the mind, the motions of the soul, so the moti del animo, i moti del anima, show through this almost inscrutable gaze that she holds. And there is a connectivity with the viewer that gives it this tremendous power.
Forse il più grande sogno di Leonardo era di poter volare. Volare come gli uccelli del cielo. Perché il volare è l'atto di libertà più grande che si possa immaginare per una creatura vivente. Leonardo amava gli uccelli. Li amava talmente tanto che, si racconta, quando passava per il mercato e vedeva i venditori di uccellini rinchiusi nelle gabbie, Leonardo comprava tutte quelle gabbie, tutti quegli uccelli dai mercanti, apriva le gabbie e faceva volare gli uccelli liberi nel cielo.
He wasn't the first to imagine conquering the skies. Daedalus, a mythic craftsman of ancient Greece, had fashioned wings for himself and his son Icarus in an effort to escape their captors on the Isle of Crete. Aspiring aviators in China, Iran, Scotland, and elsewhere had designed machines and made ill-fated attempts at flight.
Remember that your flying machine must imitate the bat, because the web, being connected to the structure, gives strength to the wings.
Many of Leonardo's designs were ornithopters, machines that relied on the human-powered flapping of wings to achieve flight. His wings would be constructed of cane, rope, and fine linen, the lightest materials he could find. Pilots would use pulleys and cords to coordinate movement, and pedals and cranks to supply power.
A man with large enough wings, duly connected, might overcome the resistance of the air and succeed in conquering it and rising above it.
In order to achieve lift, he needed to create basically a deflection of the air. We are flying because we are able to redirect the airflow from horizontal to downward. And Newton's law says that if you deflect it downward, the reaction to it as you pushes you up. And he basically understood that without being able to explain.
Though ingenious and of singular artistic beauty, his flying machines could not have flown. The materials of his day were too heavy, and human musculature too weak.
The dragonfly flies with 4 wings, and when the front wings are raised, the back wings are lowered. But each pair needs to be sufficient of itself to bear the full weight.
In the years ahead, Leonardo would fill his notebooks with drawings of a multitude of other mechanical devices. Hydraulic screws, hoists, a perpetual motion machine, clocks and their component parts, springs, gears, ball bearings. Many of his designs were utilitarian, some theoretical, but all were devised with great consideration for the properties of physics, such as friction, inertia, and gravity.
There's a great little phrase Kubrick said, and I'll paraphrase him. The lesson in the Icarus myth is not that we shouldn't fly that high. We just need to build better wings. And I think Leonardo wants to build better wings. From irrigation to circulatory systems to machines of war. Everything.
One of the greatest inventions by Leonardo is not the submarine or the airplane. They would not have worked, and I'm sure he was absolutely aware of that. Is the way in which he used drawings to explain machines. These drawings are spectacular as drawings. He is able, for the first time, to portray a complex machine with one drawing in a way that you can understand perfectly, even its interior parts. He was making exploded views aside the general view of the machine, and that was unsurpassed for many, many generations.
Not being a literary man, certain presumptuous people will think that they may reasonably criticize me, alleging that I am a man without letters. Foolish man. They do not know that my subjects are to be dealt with by experience rather than by words. And experience has been the master of those who wrote well. Therefore, I shall cite my master in all cases.
He says that I am an uomo senza lettere.
I am a man who has no traditional knowledge. And this is a kind of admission, which is in fact an expression of proudness. I've learned not from libraries, not from books, but from the observation of nature. Nature is the real teacher. I am a disciple of nature. Many expressions in his notebooks express this frustration for not being considered as an intellectual, we would say today, as a scholar. At the same time, this was tempered by the self-confidence of knowing much more than those people, being able to perform things that the others not even could conceive.
Meanwhile, Leonardo had embarked on another ambitious project, a series of books that together would present his core beliefs on the art and science of painting.
Light is the chaser away of darkness. Shade is the obstruction of light. And the eye can best distinguish the forms of objects when it is placed between the shaded and the illuminated parts.
Using candles to illuminate spheres and cylinders, he observed how light, when cast on curved surfaces, created shadows of varying intensity and length.
Cette approche scientifique de l'ombre et de la lumière l'a incité à perfectionner sa technique picturale, à trouver cet effet de sfumato qui lui permettait de restituer dans sa peinture ces transitions très complexes de l'ombre à la lumière.
The edges of shadows darken by degrees, and anyone ignorant of this fact will paint things with no relief. And relief is the heart and soul of painting.
Like his old master Verrocchio, Leonardo believed that a deep knowledge of human anatomy was essential to depicting the human form. But he and his contemporaries were still dependent on the medical teachings of ancient physicians and philosophers whose centuries-old theories had mostly gone unchallenged. Existing anatomical illustrations, which had been informed by those theories, were inaccurate and inadequate.
A painter who learns about the nature of tendons, muscles, and sinews will know just how many and which tendons cause the movement of a limb, or which muscle bulges and causes that tendon to contract.
Leonardo drew muscles, bones, and organs, and experimented with different techniques, cross-sections, and transparency.
Non vuole avere barriere e quindi non si ferma alla superficie e non si ferma al problema della rappresentazione, come invece accadeva per gli altri pittori. Ad un certo punto Leonardo comincia a interrogarsi su come funzionano gli organi all'interno del corpo umano, su come il corpo realizza questo mirabile equilibrio di stabilità.
Now he obtained a skull and set out to map it in a series of drawings.
He sectioned it horizontally and vertically. You think, well, that's obvious, but it wasn't obvious. Nobody did that. There are no anatomical drawings in earlier books with sections of the skull, and he's looking at the skull empirically for its features, what it looks like, and wonderful, delicate drawings, which are just awesome in terms of technique. And you think, well, he's doing the anatomy of the skull, but what he's really looking for is where the center of the brain is. He talks about the pole of the cranium, and the point where all these proportional systems cross is where the senses all go into this central clearinghouse, as it were. Those skull studies, which look like descriptive anatomy, are actually devoted to understanding the workings of the brain.
What sneezing is, what yawning is, sweating, fatigue, hunger, sleepiness, thirst, lust.
Aristotle had believed that sensory impressions converged in a brain cavity where they were processed, interpreted, and stored. He called it the sensus communis.
The soul seems to be located in the site of reason. And the site of reason seems to be where all the senses converge. This is called the senso comune. And the soul is not all throughout and in every part of the body, as many previously believed. Because if it were, it would not be necessary to have the instruments of the senses converge in a single location.
To Leonardo, the transmission of information from the eye, which he called the window of the soul, to the brain and nervous system, and the reaction that followed, joy, fear, concern, surprise, was the essence of the human experience. Artists, he believed, should understand this phenomenon and the science behind it to effectively portray emotion, reveal character, and tell riveting stories.
L'occhio è il principe dei nostri sensi, Leonardo usa proprio questa parola, è perché è l'organo più vicino al ventricolo del cervello che secondo Leonardo registra e rielabora gli stimoli sensibili e li comunica poi al ventricolo in cui diciamo, le informazioni vengono elaborate ed estratte. Quindi l'importanza del funzionamento dell'occhio è per Leonardo un modo per parlare anche della nobiltà della pittura.
If the painter wishes to see enchanting beauties, he has the power to create them. If he wants to see frightful monstrosities or things that are funny, ridiculous, or truly heart-rending, he is their lord and master. In fact, anything that exists in the universe, in essence, presence, or imagination, he has first in his mind, then in his hands. And they are so excellent that they can generate a well-proportioned harmony in the same time as a single glance, as real things do.
He's always in the treatise on painting using you. The addressee is you, the second person address, which I really, really like. But I sometimes feel like he's talking to himself, the way we talk to ourselves, like, you've got to get this right. So it seems like a conversation with himself in which he's trying to work it out a little bit. So for instance, when he wants to talk about how shadows don't all have the same color, he says, if you see a woman in a meadow dressed in white, that part of the woman that is turned toward the sun will be white in a way that reflects the sun's rays. That part of her that is next to the meadow will reflect the meadow. It's so beautiful.
One of the things he always emphasized was look at form in the world and try and see not what you expect to see, face, a shoulder, a torso, but see what's there. So Leonardo was acutely aware of the possibility of that kind of imaginative projection into places where no one would look for representational form.
When you look at a wall spotted with stains or with a mixture of stones, if you have to devise some scene, you might notice a resemblance to various landscapes adorned with mountains, rivers, rocks, trees, plains, wide valleys, and hills variously arranged. Or again, you may see battles and figures in action, or strange faces and costumes, and an endless variety of objects, which you could reduce to complete and well-drawn forms.
C'est que c'est quelqu'un qui a une démarche à la fois très scientifique, vraiment une volonté de comprendre le monde, et en même temps quelqu'un qui est un poète et qui veut laisser la place à la liberté de la création et à l'imagination. Donc il y a toute cette part d'imagination très libre chez Léonard, qui est particulièrement attachante et qui fait justement de lui quelqu'un de très moderne à son époque, hein.
4 centuries later, the German artist Max Ernst would recall that Leonardo's advice to seek familiar forms in unexpected places, walls, stains, clouds, had provoked an unbearable visual obsession and left him staring endlessly at floorboards.
Leonardo was, more than any single artist, the one who emancipated painters, visual artists, from their role essentially as glorified artisans, craftsmen, into the role that they occupy to this day as seers and philosophers and sort of princes of the mind. From very early on, people recognized that Leonardo was another class of creature. They saw that he had gifts that were discontinuous with other people's gifts. So Leonardo's self-imagining and self-fashioning was as a poet, a philosopher, someone who transcended the artisanal. And in very real ways, he was the very first artist, certainly in Western history, to play that role.
Good evening. Wasn't that awesome? My name is David Malinowski, and I am the Roger and Ann Clapp Chair of Performing Arts here at the Fine Arts Association. And on behalf of our faculty and staff and board of directors, I just want to welcome you and thank you for attending this special presentation. Just a little bit about me while we're setting the stage for our panel discussion. I grew up here at the Fine Arts Association. I was a violin student at 4 years old, and then a theater student at 13. And after college, came back to teach classes here, and about 9 years ago became the artistic director. So I am a product of this wonderful organization, and I'm so happy to see so many of you brave the weather to come out and enjoy this presentation and this lively discussion we're about to have. We will have a portion at the end of the panel discussion for some questions and answers from our audience and those tuning in on the Zoom feed. So keep those in your head, and we will come around to them when we get there. And it looks like we may be set up. So I will bring up our panelists for today's discussion. First, we have Dr. Aviva Rothman, is the inaugural Dean's Associate Professor of History at Case Western Reserve University. She is a historian of science whose work focuses on the early modern period and is the author of The Pursuit of Harmony, Kepler on Cosmos, Confession and Community, and The Dawn of Modern Cosmology, Copernicus to Newton. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Rothman. Next, we have Dr. Erin Benet, is the Associate Professor of Early Modern Art at Case. She is the author of 3 books about Italian Renaissance and Baroque art, and numerous articles about art and visual culture on the early modern period. Prior to joining the faculty at Case in 2012, Professor Benet taught at the State University in New York, Oswego, and at Marlborough College in Vermont. She was curatorial assistant at the Currier Museum of Art in Manchester, New Hampshire, the Zimmerly Museum at Rutgers University, and at Morgan Library in New York. If we could give a round of applause for Dr. Benet. And finally, we have Dr. Emily Peters, who has been a curator for over 20 years and joined the Cleveland Museum of Art as curator of prints and drawings in 2017. A specialist of Renaissance and Baroque works on paper, she has published numerous articles and exhibition catalogs on 16th century prints and drawings, and organized over 25 exhibitions, including the Cleveland Museum of Art's 2019 Michelangelo, Mind of the Master, and more recently, Tales of the City, Drawing in the Netherlands from Bosch to Bruegel in 2022. Dr. Emily Peters. Thank you all again for joining us today. I have some questions that you actually led me to, and we'll just take a little journey on Leonardo's life and what influenced him and how he continues to influence us. So maybe if we start with the Renaissance period itself and how it's influenced Leonardo's work and his life. And we will just open it up to maybe Dr. Rothman and Aviva.
Can you guys hear me? Okay. So yeah, there's a lot we could say about the Renaissance. When I talk about the Renaissance, I like to start by just emphasizing how much is changing at this moment in time, right? If you think about what's happening in the Renaissance, you have the rediscovery of lots of texts from antiquity. You have the rapid expansion of trade. You have the European discovery of the New World. You have the invention of printing. You have the promulgation of a new way of thinking about our place in the cosmos. All this alongside war and plague that's breaking out basically every generation, right? So there's a lot of chaos going on. The Reformation is coming, religious tension, artists, writers, intellectuals, scholars are all grappling with this in Leonardo's time, including Leonardo. And it's, it's making them think about their world and their work in complicated ways. So that's one thing. Another is just to mention Renaissance humanism, which is the emphasis on the texts of antiquity and the desire to spread them through new translations or commentaries. So there are some new texts from antiquity that people are rediscovering in the Renaissance that are particularly influential because they're giving people a new way of thinking about their world and what's possible. And just one that I want to mention is Vitruvius, who was an architect and engineer in antiquity. Leonardo owned his book. And it offered a kind of model for an artisan engineer as a kind of scholar and intellectual. So maybe a new way that Leonardo could imagine his role in the world. And just one last thing I'll mention at the start, and then I'll stop, is the classic idea of the Renaissance man, right? Or the idea that it is possible for a human to master a wide array of subjects, to become, a kind of master of everything. And this is a widespread belief in the Renaissance. Leonardo believed this too. I should say that it's easier to do this in the Renaissance than it is today. Fields aren't as specialized as they are now. Printing is new. So if you want to think about Leonardo, he had a really big library for somebody at his time, which meant he owned about 200 books, right? So the world of learning is smaller and less specialized, but still, this sort of belief that we can learn lots of disparate fields and connect them all is something very specific to the Renaissance.
I think ironically, for a period that was so long ago, one of the interesting things about the Renaissance is that it was a period of tremendous accessibility for a certain population of the people. So although the illiterate and peasant classes didn't have access to the types of books that Leonardo did, in the quotation that you saw in the film, it seems to suggest that he was not a man of letters. This is mistranslated slightly because it's not that he's not a man of books. He's literate and he owns books and he's reading those books. But what's important is where he's doing that reading. And that is not at a university. So it's outside of the institutional confines of higher learning. And so it's actually this really appealing and in some ways democratizing approach to the idea of knowledge, that a person could know everything, could know the world, and that knowledge was not kept some secret place only, but was accessible to others. It's ironic because this is at exactly the moment when the university as a structure and as an institution is really proliferating across Europe. So there's this kind of tension that we see in Leonardo, I think.
And that moves us on to the next topic I wanted to talk about is how did the patronage system of the Renaissance affect Leonardo and his studies, as it were?
Yeah. I think so. We talk about patrons in the Renaissance as being really essential, not just to artists, but to poets, to thinkers. But for artists in particular, patrons were a lifeline. They really provided the impetus for commissions and works of art, and they provided the finances, the safety, the housing sometimes. And although Leonardo, throughout his life, and if you watch the full-length documentary, you'll learn about each of his important patrons, although he works for some incredible patrons, including the King of France, he has an unprecedented degree of freedom while working with those patrons. So he's not really acting as a court artist where he's just at the beck and call of the patron, nor is he fulfilling specific individual commissions in a very satisfying way. He takes forever. They're often unfinished. He uses unconventional techniques that are a disaster. The Last Supper should not look the way that it does today, but it does because he was totally experimental and went rogue with the fresco technique. And these things are accommodated by his patrons, I think in this case, because of his particular personality. As Emily can tell you, Michelangelo was not such a nice guy, and such accommodations were not often made for him in the same way. So I think Leonardo both worked within the traditions of the existing patronage system, and he also had this sort of unprecedented flexibility, due in part to his a very appealing personality.
I do think he was very cognizant of how to ingratiate himself with his patron, especially early in his career. And he took on specific projects specifically because he thought they might appeal to patrons, such as engineering, fortifications. I mean, all of his patrons were very interested in military fortifications and mechanics. And there's one specific project he took on as patronage from the city of Florence, when Florence was at war with the nearby city of Pisa. There's a wonderful group of drawings of the Arno River Valley. And they're often just, and they actually appear in the documentary, if you see the entire thing, as these kinds of the first examples of pure landscape in Western art, because landscape really wasn't yet its own genre of art. But really what he was doing there was he was working with the Florentines to try to plot a way to convert or divert the Arno around Pisa. And so he was making drawings of the Arno River Valley in order to do that. It wasn't successful, but it was really driven by patronage, that kind of innovation, I think, as well. And I think that's interesting. By the way, they actually, when they did finally build a highway from Florence to the sea, they actually followed Leonardo's path through the mountains. So
And
that's
Emily, I'd
pretty
love
cool.
that you bring up the word innovation, because that brings me to my next question actually for you. What role did Leonardo's understanding of anatomy play into revolutionizing the depiction of the human in art form?
Well, as we know, he did participate in dissections. He worked with a professor of anatomy and other things to do that. He worked very closely with the human body in that way, as did other artists in the period, such as Michelangelo. And I think it's an interesting contrast between the two, because we see some of the beautiful, very schematic drawings of anatomy of every part of the leg, the foot, every part of the circulatory system, the muscular system, et cetera. And yet and I'm sure Aaron will talk a little bit about this as well, when you look at his figures and paintings, you know that he understands the internal anatomy, but you don't necessarily see it unless it's activated in some pose or some expression. And that's very different from someone like Michelangelo. If you might be able to call up an image of one of his bodies where the musculature, every single muscle is flexed at the same time. He was looking at it very differently. So I think Michelangelo was very much looking at anatomy through also the lens of antique sculpture in a way. But Leonardo was looking at it very differently, and looking at how it kind of informs the movement of the body and how we express that as artists. I don't know, how would you characterize it?
Yeah, I think the anatomy question with Leonardo, like many of the sort of themes that come up whenever you think about him, he both conforms to traditions in that all artists were making drawings of human anatomy and copious amounts of them. The innovations in the technology of paper allowed artists to do just that. And so, I think in some ways there's a great deal of similarity between Leonardo and any other Renaissance master who is both studying from nature and thinking about antiquity and seeing nature in everything and so on. And yet at the same time, there's also this very distinct difference. If you looked at a Michelangelo drawing of a leg next to a Leonardo drawing of a leg, you would know without a shadow of a doubt that they are not by the same person. And that's one of the kind of fascinating things about the hand of the artist that I think you can really see in drawings that it's harder to see maybe in painting.
Yeah.
We touched on this, Aviva, but let's delve a little bit more into Leonardo as both artist and scientist, and how these two aspects play in his life.
Question. And as a historian, I have to preface it by saying that for Leonardo's time, both of those words mean different things. There we go. First of all, you should know the word scientist isn't even coined until the 19th century. It's like the 1830s when the word comes to exist. So there is no such person as the scientist in Leonardo's time. When you talk about art in Leonardo's time, you typically mean something, a product of skill and experience, the work of the hand, whereas science is a certain knowledge obtained via reason, usually deductively. So they're different modes of thinking and engaging with the world. The first is kind of, menial. It's, people from lower classes are engaged in those pursuits. The second is more scholarly and is usually pursued at a university. Science is pursued in Latin, whereas art is usually pursued in the vernacular. So there are those two categories, which then raises the question, okay, what about somebody like Leonardo, right, who's engaging with the visual arts, but also studying nature? And the fact is there's a category that applies to him that existed in medieval times and exists in the Renaissance, and it's the category of the artist engineer. These are people who would, build military equipment, build buildings, make tunnels and bridges, and also sculpt and paint and put on pageants for their patrons. And you can sort of see Leonardo fitting into this mold. There's this famous letter, now famous letter, where he's applying for a job at court, and he's telling his patrons what he can do for them. And he says, well, in times of war, I'd be really useful to you. I can build tunnels and bridges and cannons and all kinds of military equipment, and I can survey and show you where you're going. And then what's probably surprising to us is at the very end of the letter, he says, and in peacetime, I'd be useful too. I can help you with architecture and moving water from one place to another, and I can sculpt, and also I can paint, right? It's the thing he lists at the very end. So like in terms of, well, is he special, right? I would say first, he's better at most of those things than most of his contemporaries, right? Which is worth noting. And second, those categories are changing pretty dramatically exactly in his lifetime. It's during the time that Leonardo is alive when artists and artisans start saying, actually, our way of engaging with nature is better than you people at the university, you scholars who are just thinking and reading books, right? We're the people who have been experimenting and working with our hands and looking to nature, and we know it better than you do. So Leonardo is saying that too, and eventually that will spur people like Francis Bacon, who innovates the scientific method, to say, maybe we need to do things differently. And people like that are looking to Leonardo and people outside the university, these artist engineers, when they're making those arguments.
I think that the clip that you saw that speaks to this rising, what's called the status of the artist in the Renaissance, is a really essential part of Leonardo's legacy in terms of how we think about early modernity in the 16th and 17th centuries. And he's not alone, certainly. But because he becomes an early hero of Giorgio Vasari's Lives of the Artists, which is this first art historical delve into these biographies of artists' lives, and this is a 16th century text, Leonardo's really set up as this divine, literally divine hero of that set of books, because his mythology as a great savior of visual arts begins almost in his own life in the 16th century. It really sets this precedent that in some ways is largely problematic, anachronistic, in which we position him as the only one of his type. When really he was part of a much larger and broader move to elevate the status of the arts to the liberal arts, which is where they still reside in universities today, right? Art history and theater and dance, these are in the colleges of liberal arts. And that's because what he is arguing for is that there is no differentiation between what we might consider to be the sciences or STEM fields and those of the visual arts, that it's all one continuum. And in that thesis, he shares this belief with many, many other visual artists of the same period.
One thing, in the Middle Ages, there were artist engineers who built cathedrals, right? But those people were usually anonymous. So what's changing also in the Renaissance is, Leonardo, right, he worked for the King of France, who would visit him and talk to him. His status is much higher, right? He's known, he's celebrated in his lifetime, and we remember his name. So that's also changing.
Interesting. Fascinating. Did everyone have a chance to pick up the handout because we're going to move into, and Aaron, you're going to help us a little bit with this. We're going to talk about Leonardo's mastery of light and shadow and perspective. And as we saw in the documentary, how females were now being painted not in profile anymore, and they were painted as looking at you, and what that effect has on the viewer of the painting that we didn't have up until this point. So and I know you want to talk about the Mona Lisa too, so if you want to find that in your packet, this is the kind of the time we're going to discuss that.
Those of you who are live streaming at home, all of Leonardo's works are very easily Googled, and you can pull up an image very easily yourself. I realize I do not have the packet, so now I don't know what the figure numbers are. So thank you. But yeah, I think that this innovation in portraiture is one of the things that has earned Leonardo such fame. And we wanted to be able to show you some images while we were talking, but it was difficult for technical reasons to use the screen in this way. So we prepared this little handout, which would help. The Ginevra da Vinci painting that you saw in the clip is not in the handout. But we could look at something like the Mona Lisa as an example of a couple of sort of trademark things that Leonardo is doing here that are certainly unusual in portraiture. There are a number of reasons why the Mona Lisa perhaps arguably occupies an outsized position in our cultural history. But that aside, there are real ways in which Leonardo is innovating the genre of female portraiture. And one of those ways is in his use of this technique of sfumato, which is a smokiness, a sort of smoky haze that he accomplishes through this careful glazing and blending of tonal gradients. And so in figure 10, you can see this in the Mona Lisa, especially in her facial features, where it's really difficult to see the edges of a tonal plane between, let's say, her cheek and her chin. Ironically, this technique that Leonardo developed was not really, it didn't catch. Nobody else really did this. And in part, that's because it creates this really sort of strange dampening of the tonal colors of the composition. It's almost monochromatic. It's not quite, but almost. In any case, you can see that color variation and that sort of tonal quality here. But if you flip the page, you'll see in figure 11 and 12, a painting both before and after Leonardo's Mona Lisa. So in the Ghirlandaio, it's a very famous portrait of Giovanna di Tornabuoni, and she was a wealthy Florentine woman. And she's positioned in profile, right? As one of the experts in the film was explaining to you, most portraits of women at this time were in profile. You can see that she's got this beautiful, elaborate updo of her hair. She's wearing an elaborate brocade sleeve, and sleeves were actually one of the most important ways a woman could show their status in the Renaissance. She's wearing beautiful, sumptuous pearl jewelry. Her rosary beads are hanging behind her, suggesting her piety. There are many physical indications of her status, her wealth, her intellect, and also her physical containment. She's quite literally in a black box, so she knows her place. But you can see that in Leonardo's composition, he's favored the same 3/4 length format. You can still see all the way to her torso, but her hands are resting in front of her. And in fact, in the portrait of Ginevra da Vinci, her hands were also resting in front of her. That painting was cut down later. And so the hands are at rest, but they suggest that they could be active. She's a woman who probably did something with those hands, who didn't just sit idle in a black box. But she's not otherwise ordained, or sort of decked out with other sorts of accoutrements. She doesn't wear fine jewelry. She's not sitting in a Renaissance home. Instead, she's poised in front of this very ambiguous, enigmatic landscape. Perhaps it evokes the Dolomites, but if you've ever traveled to northeastern Italy, this is not what it looks like. So there's a real sort of mystical quality to that landscape. If you turn back to the portrait by Raphael of Maddalena Strozzi, these are all three Florentine noblewomen, you can see that Leonardo has already had an impact on Raphael. It's quite clearly not by Leonardo, right? We see much brighter, bolder colors, a very different sense of attention to detail. She's wearing fine jewelry and a beautiful dress, but she faces directly out and meets our gaze. And it's this engagement with our eyes, our ability to look directly into the sitter's face, that's really quite innovative in the realm of female portraiture in particular. It had been done already for men for quite some time. So this is just one example of the very real art historical ways in which Leonardo is innovating typical subject matters. There's nothing unusual about painting a Florentine noblewoman in a portrait at the time, but he does do some things that are quite strange.
Emily, would you like to talk about the same aspect as to his sketching and drawing?
I would. I think that it's important to obviously acknowledge that in terms of what we still have by Leonardo, we have, I think, 16 or 17 paintings, and we have 4,000 drawings. 4,000, and that contains drawings that are bound in his notebooks. There are 8 different bound notebooks and 2 different codices, which is a different category of things put together in an album. And so he was really exploring all of these ideas through drawing. There's a beautiful drawing in the packet where he's exploring sfumato. And if you think about the idea that sfumato is the process of taking away lines, which is very difficult to do when you're using a graphic medium, he really attempts to do that in that beautiful sleeve. He shows he understands the anatomy of the Virgin's arm, and that there is a kind of diaphanous kind of textile over a darker textile underneath, without really any really hard lines, which is one of the ways that he uses drawing. Now, drawing in this period is, I would say, he's of kind of the second generation in Italy where drawing really is a very productive medium in the sense that it's used to produce. It's used in the process of making. His teacher Verrocchio, artists like Ghirlandaio in Florence were the first generation in which drawing was a very important part of studio practice. And Leonardo builds on that tradition. And he uses it to produce things. he uses it to explore, as we've talked about with the notebooks. And he really kind of, in my view, he brings a kind of new understanding of what drawing really is. And he's one of those who does, because he uses it as almost like it's an extension of his eyes. You know, and maybe that seems obvious today, an artist carrying around a sketchbook and recording something, but in the period, it wasn't really, there was no other artist before him who was drawing on that scale. So he thought about drawing as a way to remember what he saw, because he knew, and he wrote that he would never be able to remember every part of or every detail of something. So drawing was an extension of his eye in that sense. And you see that in the different types of drawing. Of those 4,000 drawings, there's another beautiful drawing of a bunch of cats. I love this one, and a lioness. And it just shows him, some of those sketches are probably observational directly from life. And on the same page, he's doing drawings of catching a moment of two cats fighting or something like that, which of course he wouldn't have necessarily been able to draw directly from life. It's the sense of that moment of the two cats fighting. So this idea of bringing all this together on a sheet like that, and capturing it and then keeping it in one studio or for later is something that he really embraces, and that we can really see his mind working through some of these drawings, such as the cats, which is one of my favorite ones from the Royal Collection as well. And then there's other types of drawings that he does. There's another drawing in here from his thinking through the large fresco of the Battle of Anghiari that he's commissioned, where he thought about this kind of drawing of the horses as just supposed to be very abstract, just catching movement, just getting the idea, not detailed. That's a sketch, right? We all know what that is today, but it's really all of these different ways in which one can use drawing to kind of see the world, is what we see with Leonardo. And then finally, of course, we have the beautiful notebook drawing with his left-handed backwards mirrored writing, which he did in all of his notebooks. And in these, we see Leonardo, as is kind of mentioned in the clip that you saw, somehow being able to understand and help us understand just by looking that we're looking at all of these different views of the same thing. And we don't see this in scientific illustration. There's really not scientific illustration like this for at least 100 years or later. So he really is, he comes up with this kind of what I would almost call observational abstraction. He can take pieces, turn them to the side, let us look from them up, from the top, from the bottom, all on the same page. And, you know, we still use this in anatomical illustration today, this technique, you know, because it's so effective. So these are all different modes of drawing, of using drawing as seeing, that I think are really characteristic and wonderful about Leonardo's work.
And which brings us to my next question, maybe for Aaron and for Aviva. How did nature inspire Leonardo's artistic, but also mechanical works? And then Aviva, then maybe you can discuss some of what's happening in the world as inventions leading up to Galileo from Leonardo.
I'll go first and then you can, yeah. Because I think nature means something different in both these contexts, right? Though related, of course. So I think the observational quality of Leonardo, of constantly looking to nature as a place for observation, is really characteristic of the Renaissance. It's one of the main things that, you know, if this were a class and you were going to take an exam, that would be one of the characteristics that you would want to square away, that, you know, that quality of observation of nature. And there's a real, I think, tension for Leonardo in his work, as with other canonical Renaissance artists, in thinking about the power and beauty and wonder of nature as something that is documentable, that is recordable and can be represented, and nature as something that can be triumphed over. And artists are really beginning to articulate and express their desire to actually outdo nature herself, to be better even than what nature can provide. And Vasari, in later describing the Mona Lisa, which he did not see in person himself, suggests that Leonardo has not observed a real woman, that what he's really done is he's culled from all of his observations of nature the most perfect eyes, the most perfect hair, the most perfect lips, and that he's reformed them like God into this one magnificent divine woman. And, I think this ethos of drawing the best from nature was really important to artists like Leonardo, but she was also a person that he observed, and he, was commissioned to make a portrait. So I think the truth is probably somewhere in between there. So there's both a desire to know and understand nature and to be able to reproduce nature in art, and a desire to conquer nature, maybe through invention. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there is this prevalent idea in the Renaissance that you heard in the film and that we've talked about a little, that everything in the cosmos mirrors everything else. Everything is interconnected and interrelated. The human is a microcosm of the larger cosmic macrocosm, and there are going to be resonances that you can see and explore. So we can look to nature to understand the human body. We can look to humanity to understand things about nature. We can potentially use our art or craft or skill to reproduce things in nature mechanically, maybe to push nature further than it would go on its own. So there's certainly that in Leonardo, right? As Erin said. I think, when you look at Leonardo's notebooks and at some of the mechanical inventions that he's sketching, or some of the scientific ideas that he's working with, there are these flashes of insights where you see him anticipating, say, Galileo talking about free fall or pendulum studies or things like that. They tend to be flashes of insight rather than sort of systematic engagements with like the larger history of, say, the science of motion that had been going on, since antiquity and the Middle Ages leading up to Galileo. And in part, I think that's because Leonardo is actually headed in a different direction than, say, Galileo and Newton. The trajectory of science at this time is to try to idealize, right? To sort of strip away all the noise, to say, what happens if we put things in a vacuum and eliminate friction and treat every object as a mathematical point and see what laws we can come up with, right? That's what Galileo is doing. That's what Newton is doing. And they come up with a really important set of universal laws that's really useful, say, for celestial mechanics, but actually not that useful for the real world, because the real world doesn't work that way. And Leonardo is interested in what's happening in the real world, right? To him, it wouldn't make sense to strip away all that stuff. He wants the noise. He wants to understand turbulence and friction and the sounds of the world. So he's sort of engaging with that in his inventions, and he knows, he clearly knows that a lot of them are not workable, but that's what he's interested in. So in that sense, I actually think, in a certain sense, he's more like us than like the people that immediately followed him. He's not interested in separating things out and specializing. He's interested in bringing it all back together. It took a while for science to be able to do that, right? The science that Galileo and Newton are developing, it doesn't produce that much concrete practical technology for a very long time.
And while we wrap up before our question and answer, Emily, I just want to, you've both now touched on the voluminous materials that Da Vinci left for us, his notebooks. Can you speak to a little bit about what that means to us now and what it meant to his creative process, and perhaps where we can find them today?
Yeah, I think I was trying to grapple with thinking about this panel about, how his notebooks could have impacted his contemporaries. Did anyone see them? And maybe someone else on the panel knows the answer to that. But from kind of strictly an understanding of how The collecting of those notebooks went. Essentially, they were all in his possession when he died. By the way, he probably drew on pieces of paper and then bound them after he drew. So they weren't kind of all bound and then he wrote on them. So they were bound into various notebooks. He had various subject matter. We know anatomy, the flight of birds, mechanics, machines, the movement of water, for example. And when he died, he had a kind of a man who's called his artistic heir. You'll hear about him in the documentary. A man named Francesco Melci, who inherited all of his notebooks. And that's very typical, actually, in the period for a follower, a student to become the heir to master. It was true in the case of Michelangelo as well. But from there, fate takes its course, and with the death of Melzi, they're kind of distributed. But what's interesting is they were held in collections of artists for at least 100 years. And so this is a primary way by which artists learned about Leonardo, was through looking through the collections of artists they knew at his drawings, through copies of his drawings. Copies galore were made of his drawings. And in fact, Melzi made many, many copies of Leonardo's drawings, which makes a very fun conundrum today when one is looking at drawings that are attributed to Leonardo da Vinci. He was very good at even copying the left-handed strokes on the sheet of Leonardo. But anyway, several of the notebooks ended up with artists, went to Spain and Milan. And then what we have to do is thank the great collecting impulse of the 17th and 18th centuries, when aristocrats essentially were traveling throughout Europe and buying up the art of Italy for the most part. And many of those notebooks ended up in the UK in the hands of aristocrats. Many of them are also in France. Two of them were stolen by Napoleon from Milan during his campaigns. And one set of notebooks were discovered only in 1966 in the library of the Royal Library in Spain. They had been given to the Spanish king and forgotten for hundreds of years. So that is quite incredible. And we have all of them today are in collections, except one is in a private collection purchased by none other than Bill Gates. That's the Codex Leicester, which is one of the treatises. I believe it's mostly about kind of hydraulics and mechanics and things like that, which came through, again, another English collection. So that it's very typical and fascinating that we have these kind of trajectories where we're actually lucky that so many of the drawings are kind of still together in these notebooks, and they weren't cut into a million pieces, which also is quite typical of the history of drawings and albums. I don't know if I answered the question.
I think so. I think so. So let's open it up
happy to answer any questions.
The audience and even our audience online. Anybody have a question for our panel? I know I do. Is that a question over there? No? Briefly at the beginning, we talked about Leonardo not being the only Renaissance man. What about Leonardo then makes him this household name that we don't talk about the others? Is it just sheer volume of work, or is it sheer diversity of work, or has he just been celebritized so much that we have forgotten the others? What do you think personally?
Sure. Well, I don't think that there is one correct answer to that question. But I do think that Western European tendencies are to create narratives around what we might consider to be kind of great masters. And that tradition emerges as a Renaissance tradition, and is perpetuated from that very moment through history by Western, predominantly white, predominantly male European scholars who continue to perpetuate the idea of the singular, amazing, divine genius that's set forth by Giorgio Vasari in the 16th century when he writes about Leonardo as literally God's divine creation on earth. And this is a humanist tendency. Humanism is called humanism because it centralizes the human and the human experience and the potential for the human to create great wonders and to create great works. And I think it's a captivating narrative. He lived an awfully long time, which is unusual for the period. He produced prolifically, which we only know posthumously, right? So there's a way in which actually the after story of Leonardo is greater than the story that took place at the time because of what we know now. And there are real ways in which certain of his kind of canonical works of art, like the Mona Lisa and like the Last Supper, do defy and break with pictorial traditions of the time. And we love a rebel. We love somebody who defies tradition, who, breaks with our conventions of the past. And I think there's also real appeal in interdisciplinarity, in someone who we perceive from a modern perspective as, being a man of all things, even though that was actually the goal that most people were striving for, most intellectuals were striving for at the time. So in some ways, it's unfair that Leonardo is as famous as he is, and in other ways, his work is really beautiful.
Sure, yeah. Anything to add, or Aaron pretty much covered?
Good at what he did, and it's worth recognizing. And a lot of different things. And I do think that his drawing, right, his thinking through drawing, his use of drawing as a thought experiment, not just in art, but in the sciences too, is maybe more innovative than some of his contemporaries.
Certainly for that time. Because even the idea of life drawing, of setting a model on a plinth or a stool or a table in a room and making drawings around that model is not something that's happening at this time. Artists are working from sculptures. And if they're drawing from a model, they're doing so in really cursory ways. And that sort of notion of life drawing is in flux at this exact moment. So Leonardo is ahead of his time in that way.
Question.
I'm sorry, I took a Renaissance course at Ohio State about 45 years ago. So, and I didn't pay attention back then as well as I am now. So my question is, Leonardo, this thing he talked about, how math and science and art are all linked. And he understood that big picture, excuse the pun, but he understood that really well, I think, in a different way than Michelangelo did. He was more precise. Was Leonardo influenced by music, or did he influence music? Being such a math and engineer and scientist, there's always a link with music and math and science and all that. But because I've never heard anything about him about music, and I'm just curious.
Thank you very much. I could be wrong. Do you know, Aviva?
I can tell you that in the Renaissance, music is still one of the mathematical arts, right? So there, music, astronomy, geometry, and arithmetic are all part of the quadrivium. They're considered mathematical arts. Music is based on harmonic ratios that are mathematical. So that's the way that music would have been grouped. Whereas science, in terms like the study of nature, is considered non-mathematical at that time. It's qualitative. That's slowly changing, but it's separate from those things. So Leonardo was part of the process of changing the way we group these categories. I do know he explored sound. I don't know whether he explored music specifically.
There are the studies of the ear and the way that he understands how the ear makes sense of sound and vibration. But I'm not familiar with him exploring, let's say, the design for an instrument or writing any music. But certainly, like, you know, musicians their status was already, because of their alignment with math, was already much more secure and much further ahead than artists. So just so you understand that hierarchy. But it's a really interesting question. There's a great passage in Vasari where he describes, and this is where we get this obsession with Mona Lisa's smile, which I don't think she's smiling, frankly, but that Vasari claims that Leonardo played delightful music for her while he was painting her so that she would be charmed and smile for him. But I can't think of any other references to music. It's a great question.
Thank you so much for your info.
I think we might have one from online. We'll come back. We'll come back.
So this is from Christine, who is joining us virtually. What do we know about Leonardo's childhood regarding what he studied and drew? And at what age did he begin creating art?
Yeah, I'm trying. I mean, he did kind of Latin school, didn't he? Didn't do Latin school. You know.
I mean, he started making, I don't know exactly when he started drawing for the first time, but he's
studio by age
16. I was just gonna say 17. So I think he's like apprenticed to Verrocchio by 17. So we don't know, I mean, in order to get that apprenticeship, he must have been doing something before that, but we don't have a lot to go on. You know, he comes from this family of potters and notaries, you know, sort of like what we might consider to be middle class crafts kind of level of people. And so it's not clear exactly what he did to train in the early childhood. But then once he's apprenticed to Verrocchio, Andrea del Verrocchio is a very important sculptor and painter in Florence at that time. And this is a typical thing to do, to move to a city and to become apprenticed. And cities were really where this kind of humanistic knowledge and this kind of organic movement of Renaissance humanism, that's where it was happening. So you wanted to be in a city, you wanted to be in the urban fray. And so that's where he really gets his formal training, is with Andrea del Verrocchio. And then he branches out from there.
He does talk a lot. He does talk about how his childhood was spent in nature, and he was in the countryside, and he was observing and with animals, and so that was obviously a very important part of his formation. He was born illegitimate, so his parents were not married, so that did prevent him from actually going to university.
And Vinci was a tiny town. I feel compelled to say that, you know, we keep referring to him as Leonardo because Da Vinci simply means of Vinci. That just is announcing the town he's from. So now that you're all scholars of Leonardo, you'll never say Da Vinci again, because we know that just signifies this tiny little town that he came from. So he had this rural upbringing before he moved to the city.
Can add that, sorry, it's just that, you know, literacy is pretty high in Florence at this time for, you know, for the era, but probably about 15%. And Leonardo was literate, right? Even, you know, from a young age. So he had to teach himself Latin, the language of scholarship, but he could access texts in the vernacular.
This is kind of a weird question, but why did Leonardo draw people?
People.
Like draw certain people.
Certain people. You mean portraits or?
Yeah, like portraits of like different kinds of people. Why did he draw that?
So all of his portraits would have been commissions, which means that someone sought him out and asked him to do that specific portrait and paid him to do it. And he didn't always complete them, but for most of the portraits he did, I believe, complete the portraits. So that was one way in which an artist made their living, was by taking commissions for specific people and portraits. So that's why we know most of the names of his sitters. We call them his sitters. But of course, he was interested in the human body in general, and that's what we see him not when he's drawing pictures of you know, his dissections of bodies, which is something that he went to see at universities where dissections were taking place, usually of criminals who had been executed. That was the most common unfortunate receptor of dissection. So yeah, does that answer your question? Is there
Yes,
another
thank
part of
you.
the question? Okay.
His books in a backward writing, which leads me to believe that he was trying to hide things from other people. Did he have any students that he shared all this knowledge with?
He did. You know, it's one of those interesting things that has often been repeated, that it was a secret, that he was hiding something. But the thing is, it's just backwards. So it's once you kind of get used to looking at it, if you know Italian, or if you use a mirror even, you can read it. So another explanation for it is that he was left-handed, and that when you are writing in the period, you're using a goose feather quill pen and dipping it into ink. And if you are left-handed, you're going to smudge all of your writing as you go, right? Or you'll have to do that terrible overhand. I'm a lefty, so I understand that. So it may be that he just came up with that because he considered most of these notebooks just to be for himself, essentially. And he could, of course, write in the other direction as well. And so it may be that he just came up with it and became so used to doing it that he continued that. So there's no evidence that he was really trying to keep things. He had very, very close students and friends within and among his studio who were with him his entire life. And so, it's kind of an open question, but it certainly is an interesting aspect of his personality and his work that he did that.
Eccentricity.
Yeah.
I don't think it's intended to be devious or subversive there's no real evidence that that's the case, because it is really quite easy to read.
Could he also just have been challenging himself and having fun while he's doing all of this scientific and artistic work?
Yeah, maybe. I think it also really has to do with like the drippy, messy ink.
Yeah, that makes the most sense. Maybe one last question.
I read somewhere, and you also mentioned that Da Vinci almost never finished his paintings. And I was wondering, is there any reason that we know of as to why?
Yeah. So this is also one of those things that makes him very enticing, right? Why would he not finish his work, right? He's being paid well. He's been commissioned by important people. He clearly cares about his fame and his reputation. So what? Like, why would you not finish your work? And so, I don't have a straight answer for you. There's no really good reason why he wouldn't have finished, other than that he clearly felt he didn't have to, which is interesting in and of itself, because most Renaissance artists who were sort of hip to what you needed to do to succeed in this sort of structure in this society knew that finishing the work was a really important way to get paid and to continue to get paid in the future, right? To get future commissions. But somehow Leonardo had such a way, and it was clear that he was quite charismatic, and that he had a way of making it okay that he would walk away from contracts and away from commissions that were not complete. That said, he often did go back and finish them. And it seems there might have been some real torment there, in that he couldn't put his finger on exactly what he wanted to do to bring a work to completion. And, maybe there was some kind of obsessive, nature at work there. Who knows? We'll never know that. But it's possible he really couldn't find a resting place. He clearly is not content with one cat, right? He draws on the sheet. I mean, there's like 60 cats on that sheet of paper, right? So there's clearly some inability to sort of let go. The cat is done, But that's the best I can do with an answer to that one.
Well, this brings us to the conclusion of our evening. I'd like to thank PBS Western Reserve for this amazing opportunity to not only view part of this documentary, but to have this fascinating panel discussion. If we could give PBS Western Reserve a round of applause. Please make sure you stop at their table and check out what they have to offer. The Fine Arts Association has a table as well to find out more about us. And I'd like to, one last thank you to our panelists, Dr. Rothman, Dr. Benet, and Dr. Peters for their expertise and their insights. Thank you so much. Good night and drive safe.